Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to start by thanking the sponsor of today's episode, Sandra Bird, author of the Tudor Ladies in Waiting series. A rich alchemy of fact and fiction, these critically acclaimed books chronicle the glittering court lives of three queens and their closest friends and companions. The novels brim with heartwarming and heartbreaking circumstances, and heroines who choose lives worth risking all. Book 1, To Die For, follows Queen Anne Boleyn through the viewpoint of Margaret Wyatt. Library Journal awarded it a Best Books of the Year pick and said the novel brings history to life in exquisite detail. Book 2, The Secret Keeper, uncovers love and betrayal in the life of Queen Katherine Parr. Library Journal calls this book atmospheric, full of twists, and a must-read for Tudor fiction fans. Finally, Book 3, Roses Have Thorns, draws close to Queen Elizabeth I through Ellen von Snakenborg, who transformed into Helena, the Marchioness of Northampton. I loved all three books and found this concluding book masterful, impeccably researched, and deliciously detailed storytelling. The series is available at Amazon.com. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, I invite you to join the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Please visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. When you join the patron family, you'll instantly unlock access to exclusive posts, including audio releases and videos. Patrons are also eligible to attend additional monthly live talks and to take part in a member-only book club. They can also enter patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the perks. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm so excited that joining me on the show to talk about the Six Lives exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery is Charlotte Bolland. Dr. Charlotte Bolland is Senior Curator of Research and 16th Century Collections at the National Portrait Gallery. She is responsible for the acquisition, research, and interpretation of portraits dating from the 16th century, with coordination of research activity within the curatorial department. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Charlotte. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Oh, it's so lovely to have you on the show, and we're here to talk about something that I'm very excited about, and that's the new Six Lives exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery. But before we dive into that, would you mind just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about you and your background?
So I'm Charlotte Bolland and I'm Senior Curator for Research and 16th Century Collections at the National Portrait Gallery. So the Portrait Gallery is a very chronological institution. So I just look after the Tudor portraits. At the death of Elizabeth I, I hand on to my colleague, the 17th Century Curator, who looks after the Stuarts. And I've been fascinated by Tudor history for years. Of course, I did my PhD on Italian material culture at the Tudor Court at Queen Mary, University of London.
Oh, well, it sounds like a wonderful job you've got there. And I totally agree with handing over at 1603. That's perfect.
Nothing interesting happens after that.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about the exhibition. Would you just mind maybe just introducing it to our listeners that maybe haven't heard about it and telling us about some of the themes that you're exploring there?
So Six Lives is the first historic exhibition that we've had at the National Portrait Gallery since we reopened last year following this big transformational project. And so we've got this wonderful new exhibition space to work with. with, which was so exciting. And so this exhibition spans not only 500 years of history, but I think is the most kind of diverse in terms of media in an exhibition, because we have portraits in not only paintings and miniatures, medals, photographs, portrait prints, so a huge range, but also a range of other kind of media, ranging from stamps and novelty Christmas decorations to musical instruments and tapestries. And because one thing that I really wanted to think about in this exhibition was, first of all, what we think about the Queens now. What are the stories that we sort of carry in our heads about the Queens, and to really sort of acknowledge those layers of storytelling that have accumulated over the centuries, both through history but also the sort of historical imagination. And so there is a section thinking about the kind of 21st century and then tracking back to think about performance histories before stepping back through time to the heart of the exhibition, to the 16th century, to think about the culture of the court that the women navigated, and then into spaces dedicated to each queen with a mix of media. So, of course, their portraits, but also letters and beautiful pieces of metalwork and maps, playing cards, really, yes, kind of diverse media to tell their stories through objects.
It sounds amazing. I've seen lots of people raving about it online and seen lots of pics of the exhibition and some wonderful objects. Do you want to tell us just maybe about a few of the actual artifacts that you have?
Of course. So the exhibition opens with a pairing of these incredible photographs by Hiroshi Sugimoto of waxworks of the six queens. What I love about them is they've got this great uncanny quality. And so you think they're alive. And I think so many of us think we've had this really kind of personal encounter with the queens, but there's, kind of, it's what's happening in our heads. And that idea of animating portraits through words and accounts is, of course, what's been happening for centuries. That's exactly what happens to the Queen's portraits when they were sent around the place. So that idea of the sort of the distance and the kind of ambiguity in the Queens was something I really want to think about through those portraits. As we go through into the sections dedicated to each Queen's, I mean, yes, it is hard to think of, separate out the treasures, but among the sort of objects, there's the fabulous letter that Katherine of Aragon wrote after the Battle of Flodden, in which she writes about the death of James IV and this great sort of quote of, "Your Grace shall see how you keep my promise." And so I think that's a great sort of insight into Catherine's kind of perspective and how her steadfastness, which as would later play out in her defence of her marriage. With Anne Boleyn, we have the beautiful, exquisite Book of Hours that she and Henry exchanged messages in, with her sort of very pointed quote beneath an image of the Annunciation of the Virgin and that sort of promise to give a son. With Jane Seymour, thinking about his mix, gorgeous jewellery, because of course no jewels really sort of survive that can be directly associated with the Queens, but we've borrowed from the Victoria and Albert Museum two very similar examples of the type of jewels that are so familiar from Jane Seymour's portrait by Hans Holbein, which then kind of appear in other portraits. They give a sense again of the kind of scale of the jewels, the materials, and the magnificence of court. For Anne of Cleves, one thing I've really enjoyed putting together are two maps of her journeys to England. The first being Henry's proposed map for her route to England by sea, a daring kind of naval raid and sort of at the heart of Charles V's territories, which was said to have left him marvellously inflamed. The second, the much more practical route that the Cleves delegation requested that she take, sort of by land, section by section, asking Charles V for permission to cross his territories. And I think that sort of disjunction between the fantasy and the reality can be really seen in those maps. For Catherine Howard, the inventory of her jewels from the British Library, because such a fascinating document. Inventories are so rich in kind of giving insight into a court. But this one in particular is really powerful because it shows sort of Catherine's rise, reign and downfall all in one document, because you have the jewels listed that Henry gifted her kind of at Christmas and New Year, and that their marriage sort of extraordinarily lavish. He was sort of besotted with her. Also annotations of jewels that she gave to her stepdaughters, Princess Mary and Elizabeth, to try and build relationships with them. And then finally, the annotations of the jewels that were taken away from her in November 1541 when she was sent to Sion. So that kind of everything encapsulated in one document is fascinating. And then for Catherine Parr, a beautiful piece of actually cloth of gold, incredibly rich tissued cloth of gold, which I really wanted to include, again, give a sense of the magnificence of the queens. And this was one of the materials by which a queen kind of proclaimed her status, that's most tightly regulated by sumptuary law. And it's one of the materials that you can see in the portraits, the different ways that artists tried to render it, both using literal materials of lots of kind of gold leaf and silver leaf and shell gold, or incredibly meticulous kind of lead tin yellow renderings to do every single loop of the tissue. So it's really lovely to have that in dialogue with the portraits.
They're all really personal items, aren't they? I imagine that they allow you to make a really strong emotional connection with each of the queens. It sounds really magnificent. And I love the insights that you've you've started to tell us about. And I hoped that we could talk a little bit more about that. And maybe you could tell us in general what insights the exhibition offers into, let's say, family networks, the relationship with Henry, that sort of thing.
Well, I think it's been fascinating sort of shifting the perspective onto the six women and some other kind of ideas that come to the fore of thinking, actually, wait a second, what might their roles have been in this? Particularly interesting thinking about portrait miniatures and Katherine of Aragon and actually the sort of networks of powerful women across Europe. So whether it may actually have been Catherine's relationship with her former half-sister, Margaret of Austria, if that might have been the kind of conduit for the Hornbout family to come to England, who are the earliest miniature painters working in England, because a number of the most sort of interesting of those early miniatures are actually very kind of images of Catherine and very Habsburg, sort of celebrating in hope of the proposed marriage of Princess Mary to Charles V. So that was really interesting thinking about that. Another kind of European figure that sort of runs through the exhibition is Marguerite of Navarre and sort of relationship with Anne Boleyn, but also her devotional writings and kind of model for Catherine Parr. And then her interest in portraiture. She's the one who's often sort of, sending her envoys most to England to say, please, can I see a portrait of different queens? So real kind of engagement with that subject. The other thing that it's wonderful when you put an exhibition together because you can sort of plan it, but then it's only when the objects sort of come together that they start then speaking to each other. And in the way that our amazing designer Jude Simmons has done in the historical section of the exhibition, that she's created very intimate spaces to encounter the queens. And you're sort of always sort of going around corners. It has a wonderfully sort of intimate Tudor feeling. I had this sort of shocking realization that as well as, of course, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard who are executed, nearly every man who's on the walls is executed. And the sort of danger and violence of the court is something that as you're kind of very much in it as you go through the exhibition. So that was something that I really kind of enjoyed as it all came to life.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I just recall to mind Thomas White's Thunder Rolls Around the Throne, I suppose.
Exactly.
When you take into account everyone that ended up on the scaffold, it's quite terrifying, actually.
Yeah.
So you spoke about the fact that you have borrowed some items from the V&A, but of course I know you've also got some private loans, which is really exciting. So items that are usually not available for the public to see. So would you tell us about some of those?
Yes, such really interesting works. Two to sort of pick out, or actually 3 to pick out. So I wanted to have a moment to think about the history of the Queen's portraits and of the way in which their images have come to be misunderstood and the way that the reasons perhaps why some queens are more familiar from their images and others less so. And so it's really interesting that Anne of Cleves, such a brief marriage, and yet she is so recognizable and her portrait is kind of multiplied all over the place, but that is because of Holbein, that because she sort of transitions into the sort of neutral position of being the king's sister, so she's not kind of contentious, that once her painting enters kind of great private collections, it's then celebrated as a work of art. And then it ultimately makes its way to the Louvre. And what we have in the exhibition is an extraordinary work from private collection, which is a copy by Degas. So I never thought as a 16th century curator, I would have an impressionist artist in the exhibition, but it does a perfect example of that idea of an artist being in dialogue with an artist. Nothing to do with Anne of Cleves. It's not about her as an individual. Another work that we have in a section of the exhibition before you go into each of the queens is thinking about the position of women at court and the stories that they told. So where we have told their stories again and again, they of course were surrounded by stories, and particularly from the Bible and classical antiquity and also allegorical figures. We can know about the way in which these stories sort of saturated material culture from the amazing inventory taken after Henry VIII's death, which is so rich and fascinating. And so I was able to bring together 3 paintings that are of the type that Henry VIII owned. And one is such an unusual kind of description that I never imagined I might be able to find one, but there is one in a private collection, which is of a woman playing a lute with a man holding a skull behind her, and the skull is then reflected in the mirror in front of her. So it's a kind of vanitas memento mori scene that I really was so kind of excited to be able to include this because it speaks very much to, I think, again, the emotion sort of the court, the kind of the nature of it, but also the role of music, which is a kind of thread that runs through. And of course, the way of the performance of love and just the performance of magnificence at court, music was such a central role. And so that idea of the sort of contemplation of mortality in association with music, I think is really fascinating to be able to bring to the exhibition. And it's something that Benjamin Hebbert's written really interestingly about in the publication, about the way that music was, people sought to balance the masculine and feminine elements of the soul. And then the final private collection, well, not the final private collection work, but the one to speak about now, is this amazing portrait of Catherine Parr, which is one that had long been kind of, to scholars' perspective, thought had been lost in a fire in the mid-20th century. It was actually kind of completely fine, and it emerged onto the market and was recently entered into a new private collection and has been conserved and put in a new frame and looks completely glorious. And this painting, to me, it's a half-length picture of Catherine in black, gorgeous, magnificent jewels and this rather unusual kind of dark, kind of abstract interior that she's sort of in. And it had been one of those question marks of art history of like, oh gosh, I wonder what that painting was like. And so being able to kind of take a closer look, what's particularly fascinating about it is that this little detail of bracelets at her wrists, and this is something Susanna Lipscomb's written about in the publication, that it has written in enamel around her bracelets, Laus Deus, praise God, but not Laus Deo, but Laus Deus. And so Susanna's identified the particular verse in the Vulgate Bible that this is likely in reference to, which is about praising God in silence. And I think it's fascinating. This painting might actually give this wonderful insight into Catherine Parr as an individual, because she was so familiar with kind of portraiture. She enjoyed portraiture the most and commissioned the most portraits of any of the six women. So there may be something playful in that idea of her silent portrait is still praising God. But there's also perhaps the even more kind of biographically resonant question of this is painted, it seems, towards the end of her time as queen, and the moment when she had silenced herself in order to survive, and kind of that under the threat of sort of arrest and possible execution for heresy, that she had to kind of profile was massively sort of lowered, that she engaged much less in the actions of court. She was, of course, still composing the Lamentation of a Sinner, which would emerge shortly after Henry's death. And I think that's this fascinating detail that we didn't know about until we were able to get a closer look at this work in a private collection.
Isn't that fascinating? I love how rich the portraiture is, that, you know, it tells this incredible story and you can see it 10, 20 times and then notice something that you haven't noticed before. I cannot wait to see that portrait. Actually, that's one of the ones high up on my list because it's so beautiful. And I know, Charlotte, that you have some other incredible objects on display. A couple of my favorites, actually. You have a writing box. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yes, this is such a charismatic object. And so this is a writing box on loan to us from the Victoria and Albert Museum. And it's incredibly rich and, again, speaks to the aesthetic of the sort of Tudor court. So it is covered at the kind of back. You can see H and K. So it's made during Henry and Catherine's reign. And it also includes a number of the sort of emblems of Catherine's mother, of kind of Castile and Granada. So it's kind of quite probable that this was actually Catherine's writing desk, that it's got this great imagery of male and female paired power. And I think, of course, because Henry and Catherine's marriage was so long and that the iconography of a king and queen was sort of well established and H and K's were all over the place. And so you have Mars and Venus as kind of complementary figures, and that in the decoration. And it's also a wonderfully English object in a way, in that it's a complete hybrid mismatch of decorative styles. So you have it's that kind of cusp of sort of medieval and Renaissance object, and where it's sort of bringing in influences from all over the place. It's sort of Gothic art style, but then you have kind of putty and the nude figures. So it's fascinating in that sense. And what I love is the way that in an exhibition, you kind of put objects into dialogue with new works. And so we have it on display next to the letter that Katherine of Aragon wrote after the Battle of Flodden, and also a letter that Henry wrote to Cardinal Wolsey in 1518 at the time of Catherine's final pregnancy, which is such a kind of resonant letter because Henry, as he sort of acknowledges at the beginning of the letter, hated writing, and that this matter was so secret that he was taking the trouble to kind of write himself to Wolsey. And it was about his hope that Catherine was pregnant and that she was in her dangerous times. And one thing that you can see is that he kind of crossings out in the way the letter develops. And one thing he crosses out a lot is kind of the word that. This is not a complicated word to spell. And I wonder instead if it's more that sort of the weight of the stress of the situation as he's trying to phrase how much he doesn't want Catherine to have to move and the kind of risks. And I think you can just get a sense of that stress in the way that this letter is written. So having these two letters written by Henry and Catherine next to this exquisite writing box, that was very much one of the moments which sort of gives you chills as they kind of as it comes together and you're installing a case.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's it really does transport you, doesn't it, to a very private moment, a moment in time. Yes. If you can imagine, Katherine of Aragon sitting there penning her letter. It's what I love, I think, about objects and places as well, but objects. And am I right in thinking that you have Thomas Cromwell's Book of Hours there as well?
Yes, this is a fabulous book that has been having lots of research. So this is a copy of the Great Bible that Cromwell commissioned. So it's at that moment when the Great Bible is having to be disseminated into every parish church. And Cromwell seems to have commissioned 2 copies printed on vellum, so at incredible expense in France, and then has sort of presentation volumes. And the volume that we have on display in the exhibition from St John's College, Cambridge, and this is lots of research that's been led by Dr. Ail Poleg at Queen Mary University of London, and that in doing fascinating analysis of the images in these Bibles, that they've been modified. So the illumination in this copy has been, there's the kind of source design in the kind of underlying print, but that's then been tweaked as a kind of bespoke narrative has been crafted. So most particularly that the figure that you have Henry in the centre at the top, and Cromwell is passing the Bible to him, and a little kind of portrait miniature has been sort of cut out and stuck onto the page, and to bring Cromwell into the narrative. And then what's particularly interesting, and this is all kind of research that's ongoing because there are changes made throughout the imagery of this copy of the Bible. In the lower right corner, there is, in the kind of underlying design, a woman with children, and it's sort of like next to a prison sort of moment, and so perhaps a kind of figure of charity, and as everyone's spreading the word of God. And in this kind of modified version, this woman is now wearing cloth of gold and cloth of silver, and also kind of red colouring, and she's sort of seated in the corner. And I wonder if, and Dr. Poleg wonders, whether it might be actually an evocation of the image of Jane Seymour, and that if it's Cromwell using the memory of Jane, who by this point had died, but in making the kind of pitch to Henry about what a queen could do in the dissemination of the word of God, in the kind of reforming ambitions that Cromwell had. And so kind of co-opting Jane's memory to kind of go, maybe you should get a queen who could help spread the word of God. And it's wonderful because we're able to display it in the space next to a studio version of Jane Seymour's portrait that's unfinished, that may have been commissioned by the Seymour family from the Portrait Gallery's collection. But so you could have that moment of kind of cross-referencing, like, oh yes, how do those compositions fit together?
Could you tell us a little bit more about the role that women from Antiquity played in those stories in constructing the Queen's image, even during their own lifetimes?
Yes, so the stories of the Bible and classical antiquity were all over the court. And we have the records of pageants and ceremonial moments to see how the queens used these stories to kind of shape their own narratives. So most commonly perhaps was the use of references to name saints. So Katherine of Aragon was kind of first welcomed to London by St Katherine of Alexandria, and there is a beautiful series of stained glass windows at the Vine in Hampshire, and where Katherine of Aragon is kneeling and St Katherine of Alexandria is behind her. And that idea of having a sort of a role model, as the saint was the patron of kind of maidens and also theologians, and who made a kind of impassioned defense in front of, kind of a personal defense that again has echoes to Catherine's story at Blackfriars, that you sort of wonder whether how Catherine might have been inspired by her name saint. And Catherine Parr also seems to have referenced Catherine of Alexandria, that there's a copy of a Book of Hours in which she inscribed under St Catherine. This isn't in the exhibition, but is illustrated in the publication. And also references to buttons shaped like Catherine wheels that she had in her jewels. That the other kind of namesakes that you might use is Anne Boleyn, using St Anne, that when she's kind of crowned and very pregnant. I do wonder, and it's a sort of thought that's kind of come to light during the research of this exhibition, about Jane Seymour and Mary Magdalene, because there isn't a name saint she could sort of call upon, and whether she used Mary Magdalene as a kind of model, and if this could have been a rather pointed choice. So from the one record of a pageant from Jane's reign to survive, which is kind of at the moment when she's announced as queen, included in the narratives is the story of Martha and Mary Magdalene. And this is a very traditional understanding of Mary Magdalene, because at this moment, Mary is a sort of under debate, because the traditional position is a sort of conflation of Marys come together. But reformers are kind of unpicking the story and sort of saying, no, this is the one story of Mary Magdalene. All the other bits have nothing to do with her life, including among them Anne Boleyn's favoured French reformer. And so I do wonder if there's something rather pointed in Jane's choice of Mary Magdalene as and a traditional interpretation of Mary Magdalene in this kind of moment. And in the exhibition, so we have a small painting, again similar to one in the inventory, of Mary Magdalene reading, and this is of a type of genre scene produced in the Netherlands kind of for sort of wide dispersal. But it has small details that could perhaps be personalised. And as I was working on the exhibition, sort of came to the realisation that the cup in the foreground of Mary Magdalene's sort of pot of ointment has a bird on it with kind of open wings that's actually very similar to Jane Seymour's Phoenix emblem. So while the provenance of this painting can't be traced because it's so difficult, because just in inventories you just have a Mary Magdalene, and there are, as I said, thousands of them, it's really interesting to think that the imagery of this image is perhaps quite a little bit closer to Mary Magdalene. And then the other the kind of one of the most famous biblical moments of storytelling is, of course, Anne Boleyn and Esther, and the moment in 1536 when she kind of has John Skipp preach the sermon against Haman, and which everybody understands as a very explicit attack, with Cromwell being Haman, the sort of deceitful counselor who ends up being executed, and Anne as Queen Esther, the virtuous queen who intervenes on behalf of her people. And so we have in the exhibition a tapestry of the story of Esther, but which was again one that's sort of incredibly popular at Henry's court. Tapestry is one of the most lavish forms of material culture. So really wonderful to be able to include that. And then you also, yes, the kind of classical imagery is also a good thing. And one of the other kind of key figures is Lucretia. And that Lucretia was the Roman noblewoman who was raped and then took her own life. And the events of this then led to the kind of founding of the Roman Republic. And Lucretia was praised as a kind of model of chastity and was all over material culture. And it's fascinating that of paintings that anybody own actually in kind of inventories that survive at this moment, which is quite early in the owning of paintings in English context, it's Mary Magdalene and Lucretia. If you have kind of any paintings, those are the ones you have. And of course, with Lucretia, you have the thing which is so familiar to the history of art because she's often shown kind of partially clothed. And so you have the excuse of praising a woman for her chastity while also being able to have a nude on your wall. And this idea of female honor and the kind of violence associated with court, I really wanted to convey that to people is in terms of the context of how the women's roles kind of were perceived and the kind of stakes for the defense of honor at court.
And you were talking earlier how the exhibition, the stories aren't limited to the Queen's lifetime. You've obviously explored outside of that and including depictions in popular culture. So why did you feel that it was important to explore these interpretations?
Yes, so I really wanted to kind of meet visitors where we are now in the 21st century. Also, that sort of portraiture has played a role in the Queen's commemoration, but in a slightly distorted way that is very much similar to the famous rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And that as the Queen's images have kind of been reproduced as a set over the centuries, that they've sort of become just as reductive as that rhyme because they are often made into a kind of homogeneous format. You lose any reference to the specificity of the original image, which could have been a portrait miniature or a full-length oil-on panel created for wildly different purposes, different audiences. And as they all get reduced to being the same, you lose the individuality of the women kind of just as much as you do in the rhyme. And so that was something which kind of we wanted to bring out. And I had lots of fun asking colleagues at the Portrait Gallery if anyone had any images, any possessions of relating to the Queens at home. And so we have some loans from staff in the exhibition of mugs, teapot, placemats, Russian dolls, and all these kind of set sort of mass media production of the Queen's images. And the other, of course, contemporary image. So while you have, in a way, their portraiture has come to occasionally kind of block our understanding of their individuality, that there is the creative space that the Queens operate in, because for centuries, that idea of the story is so almost implausible in the sort of sequence of events that writers have been kind of drawn to return to it. There's Hilary Mantel said in her Wreath Lectures, some stories bear retelling, they compel retelling. And that kind of revisiting of this, because there is this wonderful space for the historical imagination that there are these sequence of events that we know happened, but the why, the kind of what the individual personal relationships were is sort of in flux, is up for grabs. And writers have explored those spaces and to give the Queen's voice. So we have a section of the exhibition thinking about performance history from Shakespeare, who's Shakespeare and John Fletcher's Henry VIII, sort of first performed in the early 17th century at the moment when the Globe Theatre gets accidentally burned down, and has this wonderful quote from Anne Boleyn, I would not be a queen for all the world. And they kind of create this idea of being unqueened. And that is how the Queens are always remembered, is the moment by which they are kind of unqueened. And the popularity of Shakespeare then kind of goes to inform productions in opera, and then the kind of stories jump the gap onto the screen in early film. We have wonderful 1920 German film, Anna Bolena, which is really interesting to see the kind of references to portraiture onto television. The BBC television series from 1970, the fabulous costume designs by John and Anne Bloomfield, these wonderful kind of collages. And then with this kind of continuity on stage, with kind of coming round to the world of musicals now, but of course Six the Musical. So we have a selection of costumes as well, including one from Six the Musical of Katherine of Aragon, thinking about how people kind of construct character in reference or not to portraits and the performance of the Queen's lives on stage.
Amazing. What an amazing job you've done. And I have to ask, how long does it take to put together an exhibition like this? It sounds like an extraordinary amount of research and work.
Yes, well, there is an amazing team leaps into action. So it was sort of we started thinking about it in about 2019. And then from about 2021 was the moment that it was like, oh, this is where it's going to be, summer 24. That's what we're aiming for. And so an incredible team, as I said, sort of comes together to bring it all to life.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing. And I have one last question for you. It's a bit of a tricky one, I think, for you, because it's like asking for your favorite child, I think. But do you have a favorite artifact, or maybe a couple of favorite artifacts?
Yes, that is always such a challenge to think about. One of the portraits that I've had most fun rethinking about, as well as, of course, all the ones I've spoken about already, they're already on the list.
Exactly. So you've ticked all them off.
Yeah. The portrait of Anne of Cleves from St John's College, Oxford, which is likely the image that was sort of first shown to the English delegation and that they were so horrified by and sort of critiquing her monstrous apparel. And I've really enjoyed thinking about it in the context of sort of German betrothal imagery, and that because it prompts this rather sort of shock response as the English demand another image from the German Chancellor of saying, oh, do you see them naked? I was thinking, what underlies that sort of response? And I do wonder if it's something to do again with this idea of storytelling, the association in German betrothal culture with the judgment of Paris and the story of Paris judging the three goddesses, which then sets an event, the events of the Trojan War. And in German betrothal imagery, the goddesses are often naked. And so that in the painting of Anne, you have on the kind of parapet in front of her this sort of orange fruit that has sort of plexed people for a long time. And I do wonder if it's a golden apple. And so that if she retains the golden apple, that she has all the virtues of wisdom and power and beauty in the kind of understandings of those kinds of imagery. And because Anne's sort of story is so much about a kind of cultural mismatch rather than anything else. And so that idea that the English would see this portrait that was so kind of clearly full of betrothal imagery to a German audience and just be like, no, this isn't what we want at all. This isn't going to work. Like, oh no, the clues were there at the beginning. And then the other object, which is so charismatic, is a book unknown to us from Elton Hall, which is a copy of Catherine Parr's Psalms or Prayers. And it is printed on vellum. So it's one of the small group of books that she had commissioned, that she had written this book in 1544 and was kind of part of the propaganda campaign as she becomes regent, as Henry VIII goes off on his final campaign in France. And this book, which is also bound together with a copy of Thomas Cranmer's Exhortation to Prayer from the same kind of moment, just is filled with incredible inscriptions. It's a kind of royal family conversation in this volume. So we have it displayed at the frontispiece, which has an inscription from Henry exhorting the reader to kind of remember him, remember me when you do pray, for he is yours, none can say nay. So that's incredible kind of reference. Then also within the book, there are these very enigmatic inscriptions that are kind of, awaiting still interpretation. In the copy of Cranmer, there's one from Mary to Catherine Parr, and I've so enjoyed learning more about their relationship and how close they were as stepmother and stepdaughter, and the wonderful echo of Catherine being named Catherine after Katherine of Aragon, and then choosing to name her daughter Mary after Mary. And so they've got that kind of relationship in there. There's an inscription that looks like it is in Princess Elizabeth's handwriting in Latin, which is sort of chilling, which is T. Seymour, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. And so with all the questions of what happened in that situation. So that really kind of gives you chills. And then at the fly sheet, just beneath the cover, is the incredibly enigmatic, which no one has worked out who wrote it or why, but it's in a 16th century hand. I will if you will.
Love that.
It's like, great, go write your novel now. It's brilliant.
Yes. That's perfect. Oh my goodness, I absolutely love it. I'm off to the airport. I'm coming over, Charlotte. You'll see me very soon. That sounds amazing. How long do we have to go and see this exhibition?
So the exhibition is on until the 8th of September. Unfortunately, it's not an exhibition that could tour because of the light sensitivity of all these works. So this is a kind of one-time London moment, but all of the stories in it are in the accompanying publication that's written. So yes, they are accessible.
Wonderful. Yes, I was going to ask you about that publication because a lot of the listeners are all over the world. So they can purchase a copy online of the publication to get a sense of the exhibition. That sounds amazing. And thank you so much for taking the time out of what's obviously a very busy day to talk Tudors with us.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.